because we know very well what, in fact, is causing the climate to change. We know that we're responsible for it as humans. And we ought to think about the distinction between those two in order to get a sense of responsibility as to where we sit.
Yeah, I'm curious real quick too, Jim, within your own field in climatology, I mean, do you think you approach that field somewhat distinct because of your own sort of, faith background as you look at just the intricacies of how everything either works together well or comes apart if it's not sort of stewarded for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, in talking to colleagues, non-believers would like to believe that, or like to postulate that billions of years of experimentation, natural experimentation, and evolution in the universe has led us to the perfect climate. And in fact, that perfect, quote unquote, perfect climate for human life is actually a tiny, tiny little window. If you look at all the temperatures, for example, in the universe. And so for me, given that I know that God created this planet, I don't see it as an accidental one. I see it as intentional. And that's why I work in climate, because that intentional design by God, humans are frankly messing with.
Yeah, and Greg, do you want to comment as well? I mean, both within your own field and then just specifically about what you might see too in your area of expertise in terms of the stewardship versus dominion approach.
Yeah, so my field is a little bit different because I'm not dealing directly with the question of climate change, but because I'm in hydrogeology, water plays a huge role in both the climate and the consequences of climate. And not just that, but other things that we are doing. So for example, some of my research is involved with the Mississippi River levee system. And every large scale thing that man does to the environment has a consequence that it's never uniformly just, oh, we do this and everything will be good. There's always a cost that comes with it. So these massive levees that have been built along the Mississippi River in order to limit the amount of flooding to the surrounding landscapes, as those levees continue to be built up, the water is contained within that river between those levees and doesn't spread out in flood events up north. So you get these big pulses that come down the river and the maximum water height keeps going up and up and up. So now if you combine that with, say, increased rainfalls from climate change, then we're actually increasing the risk factors still more, where now if those levees break during flood stage, we've got catastrophic outflows. So that's just a little glimpse of some of the things that I look at professionally. As a Christian, it's been really fascinating and fun because I do a fair amount of writing in the theological realm as well. I've recently teamed up with Ken Turner out of Toccoa Falls, who's a Old Testament and Hebrew scholar, working on a co-authored book on Genesis 1, Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1. There's no science in it at all. And I have learned so much working on that project. And one of the things that we've looked at is the covenant relationship that God has with his creation, where we always think of God in terms of his relationship with man, and we almost discount his relationship with his material creation. And yet Scripture talks about the covenant that he has made with even night and day, the covenant that he's made with the animals. So these are not just things that are incidental to his interest. They're not just things for us to use and abuse. They're things that God has made us stewards of. And even the idea of dominion, when we look at the role of, the kingly role that Adam and Eve were given, it was serving underneath the true king. So they are the steward rulers serving under a greater king. And when that king comes around, He's looking to see, what did you do? How did you steward the things that I've given you dominion over? And if he looks at it and he sees all we did with it was use and abuse, that doesn't go so well. That's not the mandate that we were given.
And he talks specifically about, man, that ethical interface, right? Of what we do has, there's a cause and effect that actually might affect future generations. And I know, Sherry, that's something we were talking about, how important that sort of proper ethic is with the land. So do you want to speak about that a little bit? Maybe you have a question to follow up with Greg or Jim?
Yes. What I come from, where I find God in nature. Nature has been, since I was a child. I was kind of a free range child who the only thing that called me home was sundown. There was no electronic leash. And when I got to college, I found Aldo Leopold, who writes beautifully. So what he came from a perspective that turned him around to write about stewardship. He was hunting and he saw a wolf and he killed a wolf and he watched that wolf die and watched the life go out of its eyes. And as he watched that, he was moved to change his perspective. The perspective was that we exterminate predators. And what he did was he thought like a mountain. And as a mountain, you want wolves, because otherwise the ungulates, the deer, the elk overpopulate. Then they deforest, then you have erosion and the mountain dies. So that killing of the wolf represents the horrible interpretation of dominion to me, that this is here and we're going to define what it's here for and why. But when he had that change of heart, he came to write the land ethic, that a thing is right when it protects the integrity, stability, and beauty of the ecosystem. The integrity and stability are around things like biodiversity and the integrity of the land pyramid itself. And he said it's wrong as it tends otherwise. And that's a very human embodiment to me of stewardship. And he marveled at the creation and said that, he saw so many beautiful things in birds. He didn't know how anyone could deny a creator. So he was devout. And I was really moved by the way he changed in his life to see it as stewardship.
It's been really amazing for me as a theologian to work with all these scientists over the last several years, because as Paul says in the letter to the Romans, God really reveals himself in his creation. And very often we miss that and we focus on the created rather than the creator himself. But when I look at climatology and it's the systems and the complexity, or everything from hydrology to I was talking with Greg offline about mycology. I raise mushrooms. I have a friend who's a real expert in it, and to listen to him speak about the intricacy of the complexity of the language, of how it all works together, is just fascinating. So one of the questions I have then for really Greg or Jim or Sherry, you can jump in too, is just what are the demands then that faith might make on us in terms of how we utilize science to understand and participate better in the natural world? So what does our faith demand of us in terms of being in the right relationship, and how are we called to use science to understand how those natural systems work so we can be better stewards? And Jim, I'll let you start since that's a good question.
Okay. Great, thank you. Everything I do now at the university, especially through our Institutes for Resilience, which is imagine the various fields that encompasses. It's about creating knowledge towards solutions so that our systems, our social and economic and environmental systems, can be more resilient to shocks. You can imagine it as being the opposite of fragility. And even a more poignant example, not necessarily in the environmental world, although there is an environmental connection, is this recent pandemic. I, for one, and if you had asked me 18 months ago, is our health system, health delivery system in the United States resilient? I would have answered yes. Today I'll answer, are you kidding me? Clearly, it wasn't prepared for the kinds of shocks. When I think of our responsibility of using our science and integrating our science so that we can create knowledge that better protects our populations, that better protects this beautiful, wonderful creation that God has given us. It's a huge responsibility. God put each one of us on this planet for a different purpose, and it's sometimes I'm a bit overwhelmed by the responsibility that God has given me, and to be working in stewarding his beautiful creation.
Yeah, Jim, maybe I'll just ask a follow-up too. Specific, I know you've done some of the modeling of this. I often think of the demand, in the New Testament about caring for the sick and the corporal works of mercy as, given in Matthew 25. Who are the most vulnerable for the negative impact of climate change? I mean, like it's definitely typically not the wealthy who can move inland or move elsewhere. So I know you've done some work on that. So what are your thoughts there specifically in terms of if we don't be good stewards and lean into this command to guard and till the soil, who suffers, and do they suffer disproportionately?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it'd be no surprise to folks here that in fact, evidence shows that the people who suffer the most are the ones that are most vulnerable to begin with. They don't have alternatives. They don't have they don't have perhaps the financial and other resources necessary to be resilient. It gets too warm in the house, I can buy a new air conditioner. If where I'm living tends to get flooded, I'll move. I'm blessed that way. But I think that gives us as Christians even a greater responsibility. Certainly, and this hasn't come up yet that I noticed, but in talking with my atheist friends, I realize that a scientist who's a Christian, to what I was saying earlier, has even a greater responsibility than a scientist who is not a Christian, because after all, just a few billion more years and we'll have another one. Unless, of course, we believe that God created this one for us now. So in particular for some of the more vulnerable people, and I see it right here in Tucson, we see it in Arizona, we see it everywhere. I'm originally from Chile, where that was just so evident, and long before we were recognizing that we were changing the climate. Extreme weather events, which is a big part of what climate does, and Greg knows about this as a hydrologist. Extreme weather events will invariably affect the more vulnerable the most.
Hey, Greg, do you want to build upon that, either within your own field of study or even your own thoughts? I mean, you just finished this book that was more theology. I was curious to hear about both.
Yeah, so rather than just saying ditto what Jim said, I'll take it a little bit different direction. That part of the challenge is that the church at large will sometimes see the secular community take hold of something, and in some ways, simply by virtue of it being a secular initiative, they distance themselves from it. And especially so if there's a sense that the secular community has embraced something that seems antithetical to Christianity. So with the environmental movement, so even before climate change, there was a significant portion of that group that bordered on or even went into earth worship. So a lot of people in the church saw that as idolatry, and perhaps legitimately so. But rather than saying, oh, no, wait, there is a godly Christian mandate that we should be pursuing, where we maybe end up doing some of the same things, but we're just not worshiping the creation. We're being stewards of that creation. Instead, there's an effort to distance themselves from that perceived evil and actually abandoning a mandate. So that's something we always need to be mindful of, and sometimes reminding people that, look, we're not advocating for worship of the planet. And we need to be paying attention to when we, this sort of unconscious reaction to something that actually results in us abandoning something that we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, Sherry, do you want to add to that a little bit? I mean, I know this is sort of an overlap with some of what you study in terms of ethics. So I'm curious, but what's the Christian ethic then in terms of, caring for but not worshiping the land?
I hear what you say, Greg, and that's interesting. I never really understood the roots of the resistance to environmental issues in the more fundamental churches, and it almost became a political issue rather than a science issue. And I never understood that. So that's interesting. And in class, when I teach environmental ethics, we don't ever talk about worshiping or any idolatry of the environment. So I thought that was really interesting to hear that added. So thank you. But I do have a question, Ryan, for Greg and or Jim and or you. Do you have awesome knowledge about the harm of what we're doing? Besides the work you do in your areas, do you think that one of the duties is to do any kind of more, I don't want to use the word activism because it's too strong, but it's like you were talking about, Jim, when you said that we have almost a bigger duty as Christians. It's even more cognitive dissonance to live as I do in some ways. So do either of you have any kind of like bent to share it to the more general population as opposed to just academics?
Go ahead, Greg. My answer is yeah, but I'll let Greg go first. I went first last time.
Yeah, that's somewhat ironic because this is more in Jim's area than mine. So hopefully this won't sound like a cop-out. But God has placed each of us into positions that allow us to have a particular voice. And some people are good at having a voice in many, many different areas, but that's not true for most of us. So most of my outreach and communication has been a little bit more narrowly focused on, especially within the church, in trying to bridge that gap in general between the Bible and science, and being a geologist, addressing the disconnect and controversies over things like the age of the earth and evolutionary adaptation, and to a much lesser extent, specifically focusing on climate change. So where I do speak more on that is related to things like the book I mentioned with the Ken Turner, where as we're looking at that covenant relationship that God has with the earth and that expectation that we are being stewards of that earth and enjoying the earth, but you can't enjoy it if you only abuse it, if you only use it for short-term gain and you're not paying any attention to what you're leaving behind for your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren.
Yeah, and so the quick answer, Sherry, is yes, absolutely. I personally don't think we have a science problem or a technology problem or even an economics problem from moving away from fossil fuels to renewables. We have a communications problem. I have a vision for a zero cost energy, and I think we can get there. Right now in Arizona, it's zero cost water. In other words, you and I, Sherry, do not pay for the molecule of water. We pay for its extraction, its cleaning it up, and it's shipping it to us. And I have 34 panels of solar panels on my rooftop, and I produce 120% of what I use. And it was easily paid off after a couple of years. So I really do believe that we can move away from that, and there are all kinds of technical issues having to do with intermittency and things like that, but those are all quite solvable. And so it is about a communications issue. And when I talk with my family, my Christian friends, I find, and this is to your point, Sherry, that And actually, I should stop and just mention Catherine Hayhoe, dear friend of mine, atmospheric scientist, a fabulous evangelical Christian at Texas Tech. Her husband's a pastor there, and she speaks just eloquently about her Christianity and climate change. She's a world-renowned climate scientist. I knew her because we did the National Climate Assessment together long before I knew that she was a Christian. Admired her scientific work. And it is, she has this YouTube called Global Weirding, which is really cool. It's a really clever way of communicating. When I don't remember, maybe it was Al Einstein. Greg, you might remember, but someone said that you don't know something until you can explain it to your grandmother. And none of you knew my grandmother, but I get it. The communications side of this is just absolutely critical, important. And I find myself having that conversation about the science of climate change with my Christian friends as much as non-Christian or maybe Christian, I don't know, but general public about climate change and why it matters. Sometimes it gets tense because these kinds of things often do. And I used to, back in the old day, I used to travel a lot on airplanes. I sure don't miss that part. Sitting next to people, it was pretty, it wasn't unusual. Someone would start up a conversation. What do you do? I work on science. Oh, you're a scientist. So what do you work? And so sometimes people would say, oh yeah, well, we know all about that. That's a hoax. And I would, with a smile, you always have to do this gently. And with a smile, say, well, I've been working on this for 30 plus years, and I know how I know what I know. How do you know what you know? I mean, just ask yourself. Don't answer it to me. Just ask yourself, because I think that when people start to discover what it is that they call knowledge and how they ascribe something that they know, going from perhaps thinking to believing to knowing, maybe if they think about that a little bit more, then they would be much more in touch with having an open mind about it. Because it has gone, and the reason I mentioned Catherine is because she's done a really interesting study where she showed that in fact it wasn't, because some studies have shown evangelical Christians are the ones that are least likely of all the various demographics, least likely to believe that humans are causing the climate to change. And she actually found that it was really much more politically conservative related, because after all, Al Gore many years ago made climate his platform. I'm an admirer of the work that he did back then, but I have to tell you, he kind of messed it up for a while by politicizing it.
Wow.
Yeah, I can add on a little bit too. I mean, I think, yeah, I had the opportunity to when Laudato Si came out almost, well, gosh, going on 3 years ago now, over. I was one of the ones that got it early. So I received, the way it works at the Vatican, you get it 48 hours before it's released to the public as a theologian. So I was going through it and trying, it's a long document, but it really sort of pinned this, sort of abdication on the one hand, which is ignoring that we have any responsibility of the environment, and this domination on the other, and sort of present this third way of stewardship that is always contained within, essentially within Judeo-Christian theology, right? That we're called to participate, coming from Genesis 2:15. And so I think what's happens, very often is politicization. In some ways, even if climate change wasn't human caused, I always ask people, I say, well, do you think we take good care of the environment? And even if they say there's no human caused climate change, they'll say, well, no. And I say, don't you think it's a Christian mandate that we would take better care of the environment? Well, yes. Or if they're secular, do you think we ought to take better care of the environment anyways? And a third of the food we produce in the US is wasted. We could solve global hunger, right? I know there's distribution issues, but just with the food that we waste in North America alone, the list goes on and on and on. And we demonstrate we're not being good stewards. And on one hand, people are calling for abdication, which is ignoring our role, or domination, which is seeking to enter into a relationship that'd be more abusive with the environment, to extract its riches without any really consideration of the real cost of it, both for others and for its impact on the earth. So I want to make sure we give people an opportunity who may have some questions to ask, but I want to mention a few resources that came up in the chat. I did put Catherine Hayhoe's TED Talk, which Jim mentioned, where she looks at some of the research she did there and reconciles it with her own, her own background. And then I also put up a few resources. Chance put up a resource from Sandra Richter about Stewards of Eden, which sort of points, this particular way of looking at it. I mentioned some of the works of Wendell Berry. I live not too far south from him. I had the opportunity to spend some time with him, and in many ways he's my intellectual father. And I also put an article that I just wrote, Jim, that was based off my presentation from a few years ago about that sort of Christian perspective on stewardship of the land coming from the Bible. People might find that helpful. So if you have a question, and I'll start while others might write their questions or if they want to raise it, which is a real technical question for Greg. And I think Greg already answered it, but I think it'd be fun to bring it to the broader group because it might illustrate what stewardship looks like in practical application. So the question was, should St. Louis have a bypass around the city for floodwater, like in Sacramento and other places? So like, what are the parameters in which we should think through utilizing our knowledge to maybe change the way that water flows so that we can protect vulnerable populations? I'm curious, what's that balance there between how much we enter in and how much we let nature take its course?
Yes, so I want to be careful here because I don't want to sell myself as an expert on river channel flow, but I know more than your average bear. So the one of the things that is often overlooked, at least in the general public, they just think, oh, what is the solution to something? Not realizing that no matter what you do, there's going to be some negative consequence. And so it's a matter of balancing the benefits versus the costs. And I don't mean financial costs. I mean the things that are going to be made somewhat worse. So whenever you are channelizing flow, you may help the immediate area, but you're actually sort of kicking the can down the road where the downstream towns may actually have to build their levees 6 inches taller because of what you've done to protect your town upstream. And there is constantly a tension between even things like which side of the river do you live on? And there are battles going on all along the Mississippi River. That's just one example of people and towns that ignore federal mandates that control the height of the levees. And one town on the west side says, if we build our levees 4 inches taller than the town on the east side, then when that water rises, if it's going to breach the levee, it's going to be on their side, not ours. And those kinds of things are going on all the time. So, and that really becomes more pertinent to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. If you look at, well, is there a side of the tracks issue with the east side or the west side of that river? And are we allowing a more, a richer part of the population to have that levee 4 inches higher than the other side? Or it's being maintained a little better, and it may not even be on purpose. It may just be, oh, there's more resources that this particular community has in order to do that maintenance. And the other side is a poorer side, and it's not by design. They just aren't able to have quite the same maintenance, and their risk factor is higher.
Then the faith really starts not only in the science, but also on the policy side.
Oh, yes.
We always, every time we get together and we have a conversation, it always starts leaning that way a little bit too. So a few other questions came up, and I do want to mention John Wood put some really good resources in there from Cal DeWitt and a few others that you ought to know of with his organization Earthwise. And Cecil Macia put one up too in terms of some statements Pope Francis. So do look at the chat for some resources going up there. Any other questions you might have for Jim or for Greg or for Sherry or myself? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
As a geoscientist, and I guess I worked as a petroleum geologist, so I contributed to a lot of the fossil fuels that we were blessed with and actually built civilization with. But our appetite for fossil fuels is really gotten out of control, and certainly the human influence in the last 100 years has been significant. But as a geoscientist, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't speak as one. But when I look at climate patterns, and I tend as a geoscientist to look more than just the last 100 years, even the last 10,000 years, where the climate has been stable for humanity to build civilizations. But going back even further, 5 million years, and you look at the cyclic nature of, we're in an ice age right now, and you look at it like the mid-Pliocene, Pliocene change in the cyclic nature of the Milankovitch cycles. And we're in a cycle right now where it looks like the climate will increase, probably in excess of 2 degrees Celsius. But then there's a really good chance we're going to cascade into another ice age for another 75,000 years. But yet all I ever hear about is, the climate change, and it's certainly the most imminent threat we have to civilization. But what is the threat of an ice age, perhaps 1,000 years down the road, in the climate models? When I look at it, just from the way the Earth has been behaving, the cyclic nature of our orbits and the sun, it looks like, sure enough, we're going to probably go into another ice age. Jim, maybe that falls in your category.
Sure. So, I love the way Greg started his last question, which is, he's practicing humility. So what you do is, and this has happened a bunch of times. Oh, so you're a scientist. So can you tell me about plate tectonics? I don't understand it. So, and so I say, we'll call Greg. So you've touched on a number of different really important points. And what I can tell you is I'm not a paleoclimate scientist, so I can't address really the long-term record. So I'll just tell you what I've heard. The solar patterns and long-term climate records and the evidence that we've had, fluctuations over time. Those are the natural fluctuations. You're exactly right, Robert. It's we've seen them. We see them in the record. Where we tie it into humans emitting greenhouse gases. And by the way, I don't demonize fossil fuels. If I did, I'd have to get rid of my car and all my plastics and et cetera, et cetera. I just imagine us moving, now that we know some things, moving into a different way to fuel our planet. And it's funny that you say that, because when the first year I started at NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, that was 1984. The first conversation I had with the Climate Program Office people was showing me the records how we were moving into cooling, that we were moving into another and significant cooling. So that was even before I had heard about climate change, and then shortly after, of course, then we were talking about warming. There's interesting work that shows that how much warmer our climate would be because of the greenhouse gas emission if in fact we weren't in a natural cooling trend. So in other words, the natural trend is to push colder while we're pushing it up. And so I think, I don't know the answer. It's a really good question. How worried ought we be about a cooling? Tough to live here in Arizona, and last summer was 118 degrees and it was more than 110 for more than ever. Like, I don't remember 160 days out of the year or something like that. It was a crazy.
That's weather. That's weather.
Well, yeah, weather. I mean, the way we feel climate is through weather, right? And so, anyhow, I guess this is a long way of saying I don't have the answer to your question, and I would, but I wrote it down.
So I'll make I don't have an answer, but I do have a thought to share. And that's that there's two things that we should be separating more in our minds. One is major, large scale impacts that we may be having on our environment. And that can be a variety of different things. That could be climate, it can be pollution, plastics, all that kind of stuff. And there's a different issue that is adaptability and our expectation of whether things are always going to be the same as they are today. That there is, because of our short lifespans relative to the geologic time frame, we have this expectation that if anything changes, it's somebody's fault. And maybe it is somebody's fault, but not necessarily. Throughout human history, populations have migrated as they've encountered different climates. So we should have sort of a dual mindset in my thinking, that we need to be good stewards and mitigate against causing large-scale changes. And then at the same time, thinking in terms of adaptability and not expecting things to always be the same all the time. That becomes problematic in this day and age, because this is the first time in human history where we have mega cities, concrete jungles that are all built right on the coast. So whereas in ancient times, a population might simply pick up their tents and move, that's not the kind of civilization we live in anymore. So we're exacerbating the problem of, we're becoming less and less adaptable in that sense, as we're migrating people to the coastlines and building these massive cities that are now very, very vulnerable to even centimeters of ocean level change.
I'm so happy you brought that up, because that's one of the tensions, right? As Christians, we're not made for this world. We're made for another, yet we're still called to care for this world. And as John Henry Newman famous said, I prepare, he's talking about the students at the university, he says, I prepare them for this world because in every way, this world is a preparation for the world to come. And so we're called both to have, right, that foot on the ground, but our head in heaven. It doesn't mean we can abdicate or put all our stock here. I think that balance is so critical, Greg. I think you really bring it up well. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so we are sort of drawing to a close. So I want to thank everyone for coming. And I want to ask both Jim and Greg and Sherry if they have any just sort of last final thoughts before we close with prayer.
I just want to say thank you. I've learned a lot and I appreciate it. And I will take this new information and infuse it in what I do. So thank you, and thank you all.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Thank you. I really enjoyed last night, by the way. I hope you all had a chance to listen to it. I thought, oh, am I going to be able to tolerate on a Friday night after a long week, 2 hours, and the 2 hours went by before I even looked at the clock. So thank you for the opportunity here.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Ryan, for leading this conversation through, and sharing. Greg, it's great to meet you.
You too.
Yeah, my audio is kind of go in and out. So
yeah, mine is as well. Sorry.
Yeah, dittos on the thanks. Enjoyed it. Glad you all could join us. There were some good questions and comments.
Great, thank you. And there is a community app in Whova, so feel free. Any of the speakers you have questions for, follow up with. I mean, there's lots of great resources in the chat, so please take a look at that before I turn it off. But keep the conversation going. I mean, I think this is precisely the conversations we need to be willing to have to learn and challenge each other to grow more, both in our faith and then how our faith impacts the work that we're called to do, both to serve God and serve others. So thank you all for coming. We'll just close with a brief prayer. So, dear Lord, we thank you for this time together. We ask that it might renew us and reinvigorate us, Lord, to utilize our knowledge to serve you and to serve others. And we ask your continued blessing upon each one of us and upon your creation, Lord, that we might participate in bringing it to the plan that you have for it. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.